This lecture is about the return of straight photography. As an art historical term, modern refers to a period dating roughly from the 1860s through 1970, and to the style as well as the ideology of art produced during that era. Modernism was not a cohesive movement as much as a multiplicity of isms, such as post-impressionism, surrealism, cubism, Dadaism, futurism, among others. Each had porous boundaries and a shifting roster of leaders and followers. What tied modernists together was a desire to break away from the conventions of the past and representational art. They ditched the old rules of perspective and color and composition in order to work out their own visions. Modern artists experimented with new ways of seeing and with fresh ideas about the nature of materials and functions of art. The modernist envisioned a world conceived anew, not one merely imitating ancient models. Leading up to the modernist period, you had two photo groups that reigned supreme in the world of art photography: the linked ring in London and the photo succession in America. Both practiced Pictorialism, soft focus photography. While in the 1890s, soft focus may have looked radical, by the teens and certainly by 1920, Pictorialism started to look conservative, staid, too accepted. At age 17, in 1907, Paul Strand began to study with Lewis Hine. Hine was the sociologist and social reformer who used his camera to help aid laws to protect childhood laborers. Lewis Hine instilled in Paul Strand an ideal sense of social democracy. Strand's work was different than the prevailing approaches to art photography, which we saw in both the photo succession and the linked ring. Alfred Stieglitz recognized that difference and devoted the last two issues of Camera Work magazine to Paul Strand in 1916 and 1917. Strand's work contrasts with that of the photo succession. Strand preached that photography needed to be freed from the domination of painting and to recognize that the camera had its own aesthetic. This was alien to both Emerson's naturalistic photography and the photo succession. Stieglitz wrote of Strand's work that it was brutally direct, pure, and devoid of trickery. Jonathan Green wrote, Strand successfully fused the formal concerns of abstract art and the factual accuracy of the camera. In Strand's work, we see a purity of form, and the democracy of Strand's vision treats all subjects equally, whether they're rocks, buildings, people, or whatever. In his work, you'll see the interest in depicting space in a way not dissimilar to the Cubists. Cubism was essentially a way of looking at three-dimensional objects and presenting them on a two-dimensional plane in a painting or a sculpture. Again, Jonathan Green writes, with the exception of the few early ruthless portraits of New York street characters, more influenced by Hine's subject matter than his manner, Strand never returned to a harsh view of humankind. Even the portraits of impoverished men and women are more concerned with formal purity as with physical disability. Again, Jonathan Green. The artist was the producer and documentarian of the good, the joyous, and the beautiful, or the vast majority of images made after 1917. Ugliness, disease, defeat, and death are eradicated. Paul Strand's work is a socially idealistic display of the heroic relationship between man and nature, and they promote social welfare. Strand supported himself as a filmmaker. His films are stylistically similar in some ways to Ferdinand Léger's Ballet Mécanique or Fritz Lang's Metropolis. In 1921, he collaborated with Charles Sheeler on a film, Manhattan, a study of urban high-rise environment. Here you can see Sheeler, a painter on the right, but also a photographer, and you can see the correlation between the two. Certainly in Sheeler's work, as well as some of the pieces that we just looked at, Paul Strand, you can see an interest in the modernist view of using new materials, the hard edge machine. And you see that in these industrial landscapes of Charles Sheeler. And here you can see the exacting method in which Sheeler painted. You can see his photograph on the right, the painting on the left. Both have their own charm and qualities. And he was equally skilled in both media. So I'd like to show you just a short little taste of Strand and Sheeler's 10-minute film, Manhattan. I'll show you about 3 minutes worth here, just to give you an idea. Well, as I said, just a taste there. Hopefully you'll watch the whole film. I've given you the URL here to do so. Paul Strand visited New Mexico in 1926 and beginning in 1930 returned for 3 consecutive summers, making portraits of artists, friends, and acquaintances. It was there, amidst a community of visual artists and writers, that Strand began to develop his belief in the humanistic value of portraiture. Here you can see his famous photograph of Rancho de Taos Church, 1931. This church has been depicted in a number of different works by different artists. Here you can See Georgia O'Keeffe's versions, or Ansel Adams' version. We'll talk more about Ansel Adams and Paul Strand's influence on him in a few minutes. A couple other Paul Strand's photographs from New Mexico. Black Mountain here, or his portrait of Rebecca. I mentioned earlier a democracy in Paul Strand's form, that he treats all subjects equally. If you look at these two photographs, you can see the subject matter is different. City view, most likely of New York. Some close-up of some leaves on a plant on the right. If you look, the vantage point is similar. The use of line, shape, volume, even tonality is similar in both of these pieces. Whether it's bricks and mortar or living organisms, as you see on the right, all of these are raw material for Strand's sense of form and a certain purity in that form. In a way, they become stripped of their connotations and become more about tone, shape, volume, line, movement, texture, etc., the facets of two-dimensional design. Paul Strand traveled to Mexico, where he photographed the landscape, architecture, folk art, and people, and in 1934 produced a film about fishermen for the Mexican government. He made many portraits of the people that he met there, photographed the folk art. I can tell you when I was a young photographer in the early 1970s, I worked for a gallery in San Francisco, the Jim Lucas Gallery. It was on Union Street, right down the street from a more famous photographic gallery, Focus Gallery. I went to exhibitions at both, and I went to an exhibition at Focus Gallery on my lunch break one time. They had Paul Strand's Mexican portfolio for sale in the back room. They were selling individual photogravure prints. Photogravure, again, is a photo printmaking process where essentially you do a photo quality etching and then ink up the plate and make prints from the plate. Just as an indication of how values have changed over time, they were selling individual prints for $15 a piece. At the time, $15 took me probably 8 hours to earn, so it was still a lot of money back then. At the time, I didn't really love these pictures. I do now, but I still kick myself for not buying all of them that I could. Strand returned to New York in the late summer of 1934 and devoted his energies to both theater and filmmaking cooperatives. In 1943, he resumed his still photography, focusing on the people and surroundings of New England. In the early 1950s, he moved to Europe, spending 6 weeks in northern Italy, and traveled to the Outer Hebrides Islands off the northwest coast of Scotland. In the 1960s, he traveled to North and West Africa. He had become disgusted with American politics and life in the U.S. during the 1950s and with the impact of McCarthyism, which is why he moved to Europe. Jonathan Green writes, "Here we have socialism based not on institutions, but on the sanctity of the individual. Strand's photographs of rugged New Englanders, Mexican peons, Hebride Islanders, and Egyptian felon are virtually interchangeable. Strand's art is not the discovery of truth, but the elaboration of an accepted doctrine, the doctrine of the nobility and dignity of man." He writes further, "Strand's work changed little over the years, having settled in a single blow, as it were, the major problems of form and content that occupy the lifetime of most artists. Strand was free to devote the next 60 years to finding similar embodiments of his affirmative beliefs." Paul Strand made films during the 1930s and 40s. As I mentioned, he left the U.S. for France in 1949. The first photo exhibition that I saw, I believe it was in 1971 at the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco, was a Paul Strand retrospective. It was illuminating to me. It was a beautiful show, and one of the reasons that I decided to devote my career to photography. In 1978, one of my former colleagues at the University of Missouri St. Louis, Gene Tucker, wrote, "The history of art is punctuated and alive with idealized revolutions, enunciated in manifestos and organized into movements and associations of young artists, often bound together to secede from traditional established forms. From about 1930 to 1935, calling themselves Group F64, such a committed group of young photographers working in the San Francisco Bay Area met informally to discuss, define, and criticize the prevailing state of photography. No definitive statements were issued, no formal organization was established, no officers were elected." She goes on. "While they were not attitudinally militant, they were united in the concept that photographs which imitated paintings were, to use Weston's word, devitalized. Their differences were with West Coast pictorialists, led by Annie Brigman and William Mortensen, who openly tried to achieve painterly surfaces in their hand-manipulated, soft-focus pictures printed on textured papers." Later in her introduction to her F64 group book, she writes, "The term straight photography is a relative and complex one, permitting numerous interpretations. Beaumont Newhall has synthesized many explanations by calling the straight photograph, quote, the unmanipulated direct product of the camera, end of quote. For Group F64, form coalesced with content in the straight print. Theirs were pictures achieved by purely photographic methods, usually through the use of large view cameras, having a full range of adjustments. They were deeply concerned about the loss of subtle tonal gradations, therefore much emphasis was put on the contact print. Surface beauty came from the smooth, glossy papers, for much depth and richness of tone is lost on masked surface papers. It should be noted that what was meant by glossy papers in 1932 in no way resembled today's resin-coated plasticity. Soft tonal gradations are present in these photographs, which today link with the patina of time, not unlike, in many instances, the kind of surface we associate with platinum prints. Although F64 Group fully intend to hold subsequent shows, it never did. The single 1932 exhibition was at the M.H. DeYoung Museum in San Francisco. The founding members of the F64 group, you see here, the three in bold I'm going to talk about today, Ansel Adams, Ben Cunningham, and Edward Weston. The term F64 comes from a camera lens. Lenses have an iris similar to the iris in the eye, which you can open wider to let more light through or close down to let less light through. Each of these iris openings has what's called an f-stop or an F number. It's a specific number that indicates the size of that opening. The more the light comes through, the wider the aperture, the smaller the number. As you close down a camera lens and allow less light to come through, it increases the depth of field from near to far. Generally, in the cameras of the time, the view camera giving you a large format or a large size negative, most of those cameras would stop down to f/64, which was the smallest opening, meaning the pictures would be the sharpest from near to far, hence that F number, f/64, in the f/64 group, indicating, in a sense, a radical change from the soft focus imagery that we saw of the pictorialist in both the photo succession and the linked ring. Edward Weston was an original member of the F/64 group. He lived much of his life in California. If you've been to Point Lobos, just south of Carmel, Weston Beach there is named after him. He had three sons, Neil, Brett, and Cole, all of whom were photographers, and indeed Brett Weston also contributed to the history of photography. Weston started out photographing in the pictorialist style, which he abandoned in the early 1920s. He experimented with abstraction, as you see in this pictorialist piece, or in his portrait of Ruth Shaw. You can also see the tenets of modernism in this work as well. Pictorialism was the expectation of a photographic artist at this period of time. Robert Dimaschi, one of the Linked Ring members, wrote, "A straight print may be beautiful, and it may prove superabundantly that the author is an artist, but it cannot be a work of art." The pictorialist had become so conservative that the Encyclopedia Britannica described it in 1929 as, quote, "photography applied to the production of pictures in the accepted artistic tradition." Weston and the F-64 group rejected that premise. Weston held strong beliefs. He wrote in an article called "Photography, Not Pictorial," quote, "That word pictorial irritates me, as I understand the meaning of pictures. Have we not had enough picture-making, more or less refined calendar art by hundreds of thousands of painters and etchers? Photography following this line can only be a poor imitation of what is already bad art. Great painters, and I've had fortunate contacts with several of the greatest in this country or in the world, are keenly interested in and have deep respect for photography when it is photography both in technique and viewpoint, when it does something they cannot do. They only have contempt, and rightly so, when it is an imitation of painting. And that is the trouble with most photography. Just witness 90% of the prints in innumerable salons, work done by those who, if they had no camera, would be third-rate or worse painters. No photographer can equal emotionally nor aesthetically the work of a fine painter, both having the same end in view, that is, the painter's viewpoint. Nor can the painter begin to equal the photographer in his particular field. The camera, then, used as a means of expression, must have inherent qualities either different or greater than those of any medium. Otherwise, it has no value at all, except for commerce, science, or as a weekend hobby for weary businessmen, which would be fine if they did not expose the results to the public as art. Jonathan Green wrote of Weston's work, "Once we move beyond the early soft-focus pictorial work, the majority of Weston's photographs are crisp, clean, clear, and literal. It would be difficult to find another photographer of the first half of this century who has eliminated so completely all mystical, symbolical, and metaphorical claptrap." In 1923, Weston left California with his lover, Tina Medotti, to travel and to live in Mexico. His diaries have been published as the Daybooks of Edward Weston. He wrote, "The camera must be used for recording life, for rendering the very substance and quintessence of the thing itself." The idea of the thing itself is an important one, not only to Weston, but in terms of the history of photography. The thing itself, as Weston would call it, is he's photographing an object, and he photographed all sorts of objects, landscapes, nudes, portraits, still life. But when he photographs the object, he's photographing its basic form. He's generally trying to strip it of social and political connotations and instead photograph the thing itself. With that in mind, one of the things that photography has done so well over the years is shown us that we can expand our notation of beauty. This photograph, entitled Washbowl, is simply the photograph of the underside of a sink. And you see the washbowl leaning against the wall. If you look at it in terms of form, it's exquisitely beautiful. Its sense of symmetry, the quality of light, line, texture, etc. But indeed, the idea of a washbowl or the underside of a sink being beautiful, almost no one would think of that. Or in this picture, it's a picture of a toilet. But when you look at it and strip it of its connotations, it's remarkably beautiful. That's one of the powers of Weston's work, is the ability to look afresh, look anew at objects that we would often neglect, that we'd pay little attention to. But by depicting them, the act of photography itself asks us to look at these and perhaps consider them in a new light or in a new way. In his Mexico photographs, Weston photographed all sorts of different objects, Mexican artifacts, as well as the people that he met. He was active in the art scene in Mexico. Some of his friends were some of Mexico's most important artists. You see his portrait here of Diego Rivera, the Mexican painter and muralist. Here's an example of one of Diego Rivera's pieces. He started a series of portraits in Mexico, where he's just photographing the head generally against a blank sky. Another one of those stark portraits. Or his portrait of the Mexican artist Jose Clemente Orozco. You see the intensity on his face here. And again, an example of one of Orozco's paintings. Both Orozco and Diego Rivera did murals. Weston returned to California in 1926. His work is exemplified by a clarity of form. Jonathan Green writes, "What we finally feel in his tactile, volumetric, absolute accurate photographs is a sense of the beauty of the literal fact." I would argue that he also photographs essentially universal life forms. Sometimes we see in a Weston photograph like this one, where the eroded rock here is much a nude as a nude, and the nude looks as much like a cloud as it does the nude. He's suggesting forms that exist in all things, a universality of form. You see that in his nude here, again experimenting with abstraction. It's a simple and direct photograph. It's a simple approach to form. And in photographing the nude from the backside, the sitter, or the person posing, is simply leaning forward, but we're seeing the human form in a new and kind of abstract way. Well, again, compare the nude to a pepper. The pepper looks like a nude. In a way, the nude looked like a pepper. He's seeing the same kinds of forms, but in different kinds of subjects. He did a whole series of still lifes of fruits and vegetables. And again, beauty pervades. His technique was simple. He photographed generally with an 8x10 view camera, gave him an 8x10 inch negative, and he simply contact printed those. In other words, putting that negative in contact with a piece of light-sensitive paper, exposing it to light in the darkroom. Simply used a very simple single light bulb to expose, and then developed it. He made beautiful quality prints. Again, part of that still life series. It might be shells, it might be peppers or other vegetables. You see that this shell has been sawed in half. He took that approach to vegetables as well. And this, you can see the photograph of the cabbage leaf or an artichoke halved, cut in half. In the 1930s and 40s, sometimes Weston's work was criticized for its lack of political and social content. He too was sometimes criticized for his sexual freedom. He had many lovers over his lifetime. His work is usually politically withdrawn. Cartier-Bresson, a photographer we'll look at a little later in the semester, said, "The world is falling to pieces, and Weston is photographing rocks." Weston responded, "Political issues change with the wind, but art is eternal, is universal." Did a whole series of photographs of the dunes in Oceano, California. Again, the sweeping character of the clouds that he photographs here is not dissimilar to what you see in the icebergs in a lake. Following up about the criticism of his work during this time, he wrote a letter to a publisher in Germany in May of 1931 and said, "But art can be vital, significantly alive today without fulfilling political obligations. Reformers have always used the plastic arts to further their ends. Good. Pictures are understood by any boob, but art is not, nor will it ever be. Do the radicals who protested against your publishing my Kelp or Pepper also ask of music that it sound like the shriek of a factory whistle, the thud of a police billy, the last groan of a dying worker? Stupid dolts. The greatest music is the most abstract. So is the greatest in any art form." Weston was one of the most recognized and copied photographers of his time. He was widely influential. In 1937, he became the first photographer to receive the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship. Series of his nudes here. During the years of World War II, his images concentrate on death and decay. It's one of the few times where political attitudes enter his work. He was worried about his sons being called to war. His later works are more formally complex. You see that in his landscape here, where rather than a single focal point, it has multiple focal points. Their eye revolves around the frame, and we see the glistening of light as it surrounds a rock and the kelp beds in China Cove. You see that here as well. Rather than a single point or a single focal point, our eye revolves around the frame to several different features. This is his last photograph. He stopped photographing in 1948. He had contracted Parkinson's disease, and he could no longer